So just a little bit of history. I'm pretty sure you are familiar with the way how everything developed, but the first ever development of what is known now as CSS happened in 1996, and it was very crude and kind of very simple way. It progressed further, and in '98 CSS2 was developed. It was an attempt to basically encompass everything you can possibly think of, and for that reason, never been fully implemented and never been interoperable. So for that reason, CSS 2.1 actually dropped many useful features out of CSS2, and many features related to fonts were out, many of those that were dropped. And over years, when people became more concerned about fonts and typography, they actually started kind of slowly putting things back into CSS3 now. But in essence, that caused significant delays, and CSS3, even though development was started in 2002, is still a working draft. The reason I'm mentioning this and I'm specifically emphasizing it because it's important. Working draft, by definition, isn't set in stone, and the implementations that exist today may not be interoperable with implementations of the future. So that is something that designers have to be aware of and have to take into account when you use specific features. As you know, at the same time, there are many other useful developments. ADPF took over Open eBook Forum and created EPUB2 specification, where fonts were supported by embedded fonts were optional. And as things progress over the last years, there was many good things happened. Web fonts became very popular in the web. At the same time, EPUB started development of EPUB3. EPUB3 has just been ratified yesterday, so now it's an official spec that mandates the use of embedded fonts for all reading systems. And CSS3, as I mentioned, is now split in multiple different modules. CSS3 fonts module is the one that we are going to kind of zero down. Just to highlight again, probably the most important change as far as fonts is concerned in EPUB3 is the fact that now support for embedded fonts is mandatory. And what it really means for you is that it used to be that you never, if you use embedded fonts, you would never know what the results are, because the reading system may or may not support it, and therefore the results are never guaranteed on EPUB2. In EPUB3, everything changes. You really now have the option to use embedded fonts, knowing that if you do use them, the reading systems will display text and content of the ebook exactly the way you want it. That's very important. So once that happens, you now have a lot more tools in your tool chest to make sure that the presentation of the content is exactly as specified. And along with the embedded fonts, there are many other changes that improve typography in general. And so again, there are specific CSS features that we're going to describe, that we're going to kind of dive into that will tell us what they are. So for CSS font properties, I would like to go just very briefly through the basics, just to make sure that we didn't overlook anything. And kind of once we go through the basics, we will go into specific details of the most recent editions. So when it comes to CSS font selection, everything is simple. You just specify what the font family is. You specify what kind of weights you want to apply for, let's say, for example, for headings. You want to specify what kind of font styles you want to apply for text with emphasis. And the actual platform on which reading system is running will most likely make the specific mapping of the font names and font family names and weights and styles that you specify to specific font faces that are going to be used to render the text. Again, that's what the basic font selection looks like. But now, when it comes to controlling specific way of presenting text, it becomes a little bit more complex, because now you do want to specify, when you create the content, you do want to specify font fallback. Because if you don't specify it, you will end up getting something that you don't know what it is. And if you know, for example, that multiple different platforms, such as ebook from Barnes & Noble, Nook, or Kindle, or many other reading systems, since you know that many of them support specific fonts that are not exactly the same as other platforms support, you might want to specify a specific sequence of the font selection or font fallback for a particular content. So in this case, for example, I choose Malabar as the first choice and Cecilia as the second choice, given basically the rest to the default selections. What is important to pay attention to here is that not only you specify the specific sequence of fonts to use, but you also need to make sure that you, when you specify weights and styles, these selections are meaningful. And what I mean by that is that, for example, if you specify, like I did, if I want to really put an emphasis on top-level headings, and I want to use very heavy font, in this particular example, I know that Malabar doesn't really have that weight available on any of the reading systems. And what happens as a result is not guaranteed. Some reading systems may resort to using regular weight because the one I asked is not available. And the other reading systems may synthesize the black weight basically by smearing the font, which is also not a good thing. And specifically, what you need to be aware of is that in some cases, if, for example, if I ask for italic and italic is not available, most of the platforms would most likely synthesize it by obliquing the font, which is okay for Latin text, but not okay for example, for Japanese. So these are the kind of choices that you need to be aware of because platforms, unfortunately, sometimes kind of take over and do things that are not necessarily exactly what designer wanted them to do. To make things even more complicated, when CSS was created, the kind of gradual scale of different weights that was defined in CSS was essentially borrowed from Windows. And in Windows, and also that was presented as an example in OpenType font specification, these are the scale of weights that are kind of specified as enumeration. In real life, however, fonts are never exactly the same. So, for example, if you look at the family of Helvetica, you can see that the actual weights specified for different versions of, for different weights of the same family isn't exactly the same as CSS definitions. So that means that whenever you specify a particular weight, you may not get what you want because the platform, again, will map something different than what you initially wanted. And that's something that you just need to be aware of. And there is a way to make sure that you get what you want pretty much every time you want to do it. So now, one way to get what you want is to specify exactly the font face you want to apply. The caveat of this is that if you do it, you need to be very careful about using the font names for this face. Because, again, every font has multiple different font names specified in it. Some of them are TrueType specific, some of them are PostScript names. Depending on the platform may choose one or another. And in addition to that, there are also many different localized names if the font is, for example, is for a non-Latin character set. So in this case, kind of the way to bulletproof your design is to make sure that all possible variations of the font face names are selected as your essentially fallback sequence. So once you specify that cascade, as if you include all the possible names, you are more or less guaranteed that you will actually get what you want. That is given that you know that font is available. And if it's not available, then the only choice that you have is to use embedded fonts, which is probably the most interesting part of this. So with embedded fonts, like I said earlier, starting with EPUB 3, it is guaranteed for the reading system to support embedded fonts whenever they're present in the EPUB file. It means that you now have a meaningful tool in your hands, and you can actually you can use them, you can license the fonts that you choose and not that what a manufacturer provides, and you can design your content using specific type choices that we will touch on this a little bit later in the second part of the presentation. For that to happen, there is a command that needs to be used, is add font face. This command was specifically removed from CSS 2.1, and in essence, that's the reason why, even though EPUB 3 is in the major part based on CSS 2.1 specification, it includes modules of the CSS 3, and specifically CSS 3 fonts module that is still work in draft. Again, I am emphasizing this again because you need to make sure that you understand that even though most of the features are well-defined and well implemented today, there are still some new features that are added that support for them may not be guaranteed. So that's that's the tricky part when you deal with working draft specs. And now that we actually add font face command in our possession, everything changes. Now everything is pretty much well determined, and here's what happens. If you want to specify a font of your choice, you have a complete freedom to name it the way you like it. You specify exactly what that resource is going to be. So in this case, I said that my font family will be called calligraphic script, and the actual font that I'm going to map it to is going to be Comic Sans Pro. That's my choice. I can name it any way I like, and now every time I use actually calligraphic script as a font name, I know exactly what I'm going to get. There is no ambiguity at all. I mean, I'm going to get that particular font and that particular font only. If let's say in case if I want to have elaborate family, such as Helvetica or Frutiger, for example, and I need to specify multiple different faces for multiple different weights and style, this is the way to do it. You specify same exact font family name, but you give specific resource mapping for each particular face. So that's, again, that gives you full control over the appearance of your content, and now pretty much there are no ambiguity left. You know exactly what's going to be used for your text. However, in some cases, I would recommend paying specific attention. So let's say you know that some devices support font Malabar, such as, for example, Nook, and you want to use it. Some other devices may not support it, and here's the question. How do I make sure that, let's say, if device has the font, I will use that font in particular on the device. If it doesn't, I will use my embedded font. And the reason, the way to do it is actually what's shown here. The reason you want to do it this way is because most of the fonts that are provided by the manufacturer are actually not only specifically hand-tuned for a particular device, but they also hand-tuned for a particular screen type of the device. So it's a good idea to use local font if you have it, and then switch to embedded font if a different device doesn't have it. So again, that's why you probably want to include local font selection if you know that it might be available and it's your choice. When it comes to, again, using that font face in EPUB, you have two font formats that are guaranteed to be supported, which is OpenType and what's known as a web open font format, which is basically a packaging format for OpenType data. And EPUB 3 also supports SVG and essentially by inclusion SVG fonts. However, the slide says it all. Use it at your own risk because there isn't really a guarantee of what you're going to get with SVG fonts. Some features just basically cannot be supported with SVG, features that OpenType usually supports. Not all of them supported by SVG. It's not so critical for the EPUB, but critical in many cases for the web, and because the web content can easily become EPUB content and vice versa, it's a good idea when you use fonts to specify the format. So it gives at least a hint to the reading system or to the browser of what kind of resource this is. And if for whatever reason reading system has a preference from, let's say, for one resource versus another, then it will be easy for the reading system to make that choice and basically say, I want to download or use this particular resource versus the other one. And once you have CSS3 features in your possession, one of the goodies that CSS3 fonts module provides is the use of Unicode range that allows you to actually create your own composite fonts. So in this particular example, I used 2 different fonts from the Droid family to create one composite font with name Droid Sans. They don't have to be from the same family. You can choose different fonts from different families and composite them into font family of your own design. So in essence, if you have multilingual text that you need to display, you can mix multiple different font faces into what's known as a single family as far as CSS is concerned. And that's the way to do it. Similar, you can split one font into multiple different subsets and now composite those subsets back into a single font. Doesn't make sense to do it for the EPUB only. But again, if you use content that is both designed for EPUB and for the web, this technique helps your web content to download faster. Because once you have fonts split, each subset will be much smaller. It will download faster. And if you know that, for example, your page uses only Latin text, or this particular page, and the next one might switch to Japanese, then by doing this, you help create better user experience by making sure that the page will show up faster when it's viewed on the web. And when it comes to really kind of cutting-edge new features that CSS3 just recently added, this is something that's been discussed and agreed, but not yet guaranteed. Just emphasizing this again. So as you know, OpenType provides many different font features that are really advanced. Some of them are mandatory for certain language selections. So if you, for example, if you ever need to design a content that, for example, uses some of the index scripts, there is no way you can avoid using specific tools such as ligatures and alternative glyphs, because that's in essence something that's required by the language that you're working with. In some other languages, ligatures and alternative glyphs are more of a luxury, and if you want to create a content that is much higher of typographic quality, that's where you want to use it. So for that to happen, again, these features are specified by the OpenType, not by CSS. CSS provides tools that allow you to map OpenType features to a particular content that you're designing. And just to show you what kind of features we're talking about, so again, in Arabic and index scripts, or many index scripts in essence, many ligatures are mandatory. That's, if you look at the Arabic or Indic text, here you can see that, for example, that what appears as a single glyph here is a combination of multiple different, essentially, characters. And same examples are highlighted here from different parts of the text. So for this text to appear on the screen, what you need to use is essentially 2 subclasses of CSS features that allow you to precisely control this. One of them is font variant, which becomes, it used to be present in CSS2, but it was just, it was just a command. Now this command becomes a shorthand, and it's extended with multiple different subproperties, where each subproperty controls a specific feature. The alternate way of doing the same exact thing is using font feature settings, where now you can precisely control what's supported by a specific font that you use as an embedded font. There are similarities between them, but there are also differences, and that's why I want to kind of emphasize what these differences and similarities are. So when it comes, for example, again, just by looking at the example, when it comes to using discretionary ligatures or small caps, if I want to use font variants for this, I can do it. I can just specify that I want to use, for example, for small caps, I want to switch to all small caps for a particular portion of the text. And I also want to apply all common and discretionary ligatures. It will work as intended, but if for some reason the font that my choosing is not available and the default font will be chosen, these features may be synthesized by the platforms. So, for example, many platforms will try to synthesize small caps by basically scaling down the regular caps. And it may not look exactly the way I wanted, but at least it will look similar to what I intended it to look. If I use the same exact features set or triggered as using font feature settings, the result will be the same given the same font, but if the same font is not available, the default glyph and default font will always be used. There is no synthesis. So there is very specific behavior of what's going to happen if these features are not supported for a particular font. In one case, they may be synthesized and you really don't know the result. In a different case, you know exactly what's going to happen. If features not supported, you will get the default. Again, an illustration of what's the difference could be. So let's say this is the font, this is the text that's set using font Bellow Pro that has multiple different stylistic sets and alternative glyphs and also discretionary ligatures. This is what the default version of the font looks like. And if I want to switch, for example, in this case, I am switching to, in the first line, I am switching to discretionary ligatures, to use of discretionary ligatures. In the second line, I switch to all small caps. And the third line, I switch to alternative style ligatures. So basically, you can see if I go back and forth, you can see the changes applied to the text. Other font variant subproperties include control over numeric features. It includes control over, you can choose whether, for example, your numbers will be set using proportional or tabular figures, lining or old style, and you also control specific appearance for fractions. You can use either diagonal or stacked. Or in typographic term, anybody knows what the typographic terms for diagonal or stacked fractions are? Well, the stacked fractions called not fractions. What's the diagonal used called? Vulgar. I don't know why, but that's what they call. And again, you also have, as a font variant feature, one of them is you can have control over the alternate glyph shapes. This is where it becomes tricky because there may be more than one set of alternate glyph shapes supported by the font. Fonts may have different stylistic sets. The number of stylistic sets could be up to 100, I guess. Is that right? Or more than 100? Well, I mean, in theory.
You can have any number of glyphs, but the usual support is for only up to 20 stylistic sets.
Okay. And that's where you start using very, very specific settings that fonts support. So you really need to dive into deep, deep details of a particular font of your choosing and figure out what settings need to be applied here for that particular view of content that you want to achieve. To make it a little bit more user-friendly, for example, you can see here in this example that you actually need to know the number of the style set that you're going to use, and you also need to know the number of the set of alternative glyphs that you want to invoke here. You can use it using, you can kind of make it user-friendly by using font feature value set, when you can use this to, for example, name swash set number 2 as flowing, and now in the actual text of the CSS, you can now switch to using name of the value rather than the actual number, so it becomes at least more logical and more readable. You can work with your own content and be less, it can be less confusing for you. That's the primary, kind of the primary reason for font feature value to be introduced. And this is yet another example of what kind of creative things can be accomplished by using multiple different feature sets and multiple different stylistic sets. There is a font, Cosmic, developed by Font Shop, and just to illustrate what can be done with this font, Eric van Vlaken, which is one of the authors of the WAF submission, he modified this font to essentially create 3 alternative glyph sets. And now you can choose either one of them, but one particular use that he applied for these 3 different sets is basically rotating through them. And when you do it, I have a canned demo, but since I do have internet connection here, I will show it live. So basically, when you do it, and the way how this page is designed is that as soon as I put my cursor over the text, it will start circling around the different glyph sets, which kind of makes this text. Oh, sorry, I see it, you don't. Let me move it here. So you see this, I can tickle this font every time I do it. It actually moves. And well, that's just a kind of cute way to illustrate of what actually can be achieved with multiple different style sets and alternative glyphs. Okay. Yep. Yes.
Does this work in any kind of browser?
Well, right now, this particular feature only works in Firefox. But again, this is something that was very, very recently added to. Again, this is still a working draft. I'm pretty sure that once this feature is standardized, it will be supported by many browsers, if not all, probably all. But again, since EPUB reading systems are expected to support features defined by CSS3 fonts module, I really hope that we will soon see all these features supported by the reading systems as well. Okay. So that's the CAN demo. And when it comes to, there are many other features that I don't want to go through all the details because you can find them in the spec, but just wanted to make sure that at least we don't forget and overlook them. One particular kind of attention that I would like to bring to your attention is this last one example. So in essence, again, there are specific language styles that needs to be invoked when you deal with non-Latin languages. And that particular feature is, again, supported by OpenType. Now, via CSS and HTML language tags, it also supported in your content. So it's not as glamorous as the previous example, but it is really important for those people who actually speak different languages. So it's, where's my cursor? So this page just shows you what there are some very small differences that can be invoked. For example, this is the Turkish text that uses Latin alphabet, but when you actually set the language to Turkish, there are some small changes that happen with different glyphs, because that's our traditional rendering of those glyphs, even though, for example, it's capitalized, but they still use dots and so forth. So it's just an example of very specific kind of subtle changes that need to be happen when you use different languages. And okay, so now we are going to just briefly kind of look through the rendering considerations that, again, you need to be aware of, because that's something that when you deal with different platforms and different hardware, you just at least need to be aware that something may happen that will affect the way how text is looked at and perceived. So again, first of all, you need to understand that unlike the regular graphics, glyph outlines are, in essence, graphical objects. The only difference between the regular graphics and glyphs is that glyphs are complex, and they're always scaled down to such a small size that many features of the glyphs become essentially, they take space that is only a fraction of a pixel. And that's where the complexity becomes paramount, because when you need to display something that is extremely sensitive to human perception. So again, the readability is affected when you display text. And when you need to make decisions on how the fraction of a pixel needs to be displayed, different platforms do it differently. And some people praise one platform and dislike the way how it's done on the other platforms. Windows and Mac are always compared as two alternative examples. I don't see the difference as bad. I think that actually the difference between different platforms is what's driving people to perfect this. And over time, we've seen how rendering became more and more precise. But there are differences, and you need to be aware of this. So again, one specific reason that there are differences is that you display text, which is, again, consists of small, thin lines, and this content is pixelated. And there is no way to avoid it. You can do it in different ways. You can do it as monochrome rendering. You can use grayscale, or if you know that you're using LCD as a medium, you can use the subpixel color arrangement to make much more precise rendering. That's what's known as subpixel rendering. But in essence, there are always going to be some artifacts, and different platforms and essentially different platform designers or different developers, they made different choices as to how to tackle these difficulties. So that's what the ideal outline would look like in this particular scale, but because it has to be pixelated for the particular scale, the grayscale would look like this, and the subpixel render in essence would capitalize or exploit the specific color arrangement of the LCD screen, and therefore the actual rendering results would look like what you see on this picture. These are just series of snapshots that show you the difference between different platforms and different rendering modes. Again, you can always pinpoint something that looks better than another platform. My message to you, and the reason I included those snapshots here, is just to make sure that you are aware that there will always be differences, and same platform may perform better in one case and worse than in the other platform in another case. So it's just something that you need to take into consideration. And because we are dealing with ebooks, and ebooks are, many of them at least, use e-paper as a display medium, there are some very specific things that happen here that you need to, at least again, to be aware of. So the way how e-paper displays the content is that they have these bubbles that are filled with liquid. There are small colored particles that are charged, and depending on the charge that applied to outside electrodes, you will get either white or black. The problem here is that you're never going to get white or black. You're going to always get either light gray or dark gray. And the control of each particular particle it's impossible to control each one of them precisely. So the reality that you're going to get something that is kind of a little bit of a fuzzy set of particles that may or may not display the level of gray that you want to be, or actually that system designer wants to display. And that is specifically the reason why I told you that if you have a chance to use local fonts, and this is the fonts that satisfy your needs, it's probably a good idea to use them. However, because local fonts on one screen may not be supported on another system, that's where you will complement your design by having same exact font as embedded, so that the same content is presented, at least layout is the same on all systems. And that's it. So now that you know the technology behind all this, you need to know how to choose fonts for what you need to accomplish, and Dan will present this part. Thank you. Yes.
It's really great that we have all of this control available in the new spec, and it sounds really, really promising. The reality is tricky, of course, not just from some of the issues that Vlad was talking about in terms of the inconsistent support of the spec, because it's not final and we don't know we don't know for certain that every platform is going to be supporting every implementation. There's also the difference that there are various font formats, there are different physical capabilities of various kinds of screens, but also not all type designs ought to be used for all of these devices. The rendering issue is the start of a lot of these. We understand that this is the ideal version of what everyone imagines these typefaces to look like in their heads, with these smooth lines and nice round curves and crisp details. The software translation of that starts adding some trickiness to this. You already see where letters are beginning to collide as it creates this illusion of the pixels creating a shape. And then the physical screen makes that a bit more complex, because there's not just one type of screen, there are multiple types. So this is pretty good sub-pixel rendering on an LCD screen of fairly high resolution. This is the lower end of an e-ink screen, which only has 4 levels of gray. And even if you look at these two slides, there are some advantages and disadvantages to the way these render. Regardless of that, you just have to understand that things do render differently, and you have to make choices that can support a variety of results. So it's a bit tricky. We know that in a general rule, Mac and Windows have different approaches to how text ought to be displayed, and it gets a little bit more complicated when we move into the area of ebooks, because we have a greater range of screens that we're dealing with, from something like the iPad to very high resolution screen of the iPhone 4 to the much lower resolution screens of something like the Kindle or the Nook devices. Type choice is one of the first really critical steps when dealing with this. As much as it breaks our heart as a vendor with a vast library of choices to choose from, you shouldn't pick anything just because it's there. The history of typography is very much one of designs responding to the situation of how text is going to be presented, whether it's printed with hot metal type, or if it's printed with phototype, or adapted for early digital printing solutions, or for the screen. And a lot of designs for typefaces that have been carried on through decades or centuries may not actually be the best choice for this context, or they may require some further adaptations to the design in order to work. And you can't really be afraid of saying that just because something, for instance, is a classic book typeface, you can't be afraid to say, but it doesn't work now for this situation, because ultimately you want to be in service of the reader and what's going to be a comfortable experience for them to actually take in the text. And if you are a pretty hardcore typographer, this may not be new information for you, but I think for people who have a more casual relationship with type choice, this is a pretty big deal. Not all typefaces specified at the same size look like they're at the same size. It has quite a lot to do with the vertical proportions of the elements within a given typeface design. So a lot of typefaces that we're used to seeing in a screen environment, like default web fonts, or a lot of the fonts that were made defaults in early ebook readers, have what we call pretty generous X height. There's a lot of distance from the base of a letter to the height of the lowercase letters. The reality is most typefaces have a pretty different proportion for that distance that make the text look like a different size. A lot of classic book typefaces, like Gaudi Old Style here or Bembo, have actually pretty small X height that makes the letters appear smaller and makes some of those interior shapes close up a little bit, particularly on screen. And when you begin mixing typefaces, there can actually be some dramatic differences between the apparent size of the text. So if you are working with a device that allows people to switch from one font to another, or if you're mixing fonts within a publication where you've specified quite specifically what the fonts are, you have to understand that can really change, and you have to make some choices in how you specify type to get around it. You can also see that the effect of this apparent change in size also affects the appearance of the spacing between the lines. So these are all typefaces set at exactly the same size with exactly the same line spacing, but you see whereas Helvetica looks quite large and generous, the line spacing seems quite tight. The Garamond, the letters are much smaller and a little bit harder to distinguish, but you have a more comfortable amount of space between the lines. Zooming in further on details of specific typeface designs, we know as a general rule of thumb from seeing how fonts have appeared in different devices that very, very straight vertical and horizontal details perform best on screen, and regular curvature that doesn't sort of change direction too quickly appears best on screen, but it's just not the case, not only with all typeface designs, but even with all letters within any given alphabet. For some classic typefaces that are revered for their delicacy and grace, for instance, Optima and Palatino have very, very shallow curvatures built into the design. Those actually flatten out quite nicely at comfortable text sizes. Those curvatures are so shallow, they just snap into place and you don't get anything distracting. When you start moving into larger display sizes, these can be tricky designs to work with because you may jump from one row of pixels to another as the rendering system tries to reflect the subtleties of this design. So the scale at which you use a given typeface chosen can be quite important for the quality of how it's displayed. You see here an example from, this is the website, but similar issues can happen to any kind of screen-based design. Look at the capital A in the word Mad Men. That distinctive typeface that the New Yorker uses, for the most part, looks great, but there's a detail that you can't really get around on screen that can be distracting if the overall design and the overall typographic system doesn't support it and sort of absorb this shortcoming of the context, which is the type on the screen. In terms of the effects of specific styles of typefaces, the shapes of the letters really do affect the overall sense of space you have within each letter and the space around it. Frutiger and Helvetica are both very, very easy to distinguish character shapes on screen at most sizes. Frutiger, though, because of some of the decisions made in its design, has a little bit more feeling of space and air around it, which in certain situations and sizes can lead to much greater clarity. And that just comes from the fact that those, say, the strokes in the lowercase e don't come all the way up and begin to close in on the interior space. It leaves you a little bit more air between letters, as you see between the R and the O. These are sort of pretty hardcore typographic details, but if you're just sort of aware that they have an effect, you can ask, well, is there another choice that we have? Is this the best one for the scenario? And get the right effect for the reader, who ultimately, it's their experience that's the priority in an ideal world. When you are specifying families to work with, it's good to look at not just the basic text style, but also the italics and the bolds, particularly for a lot of electronic content. You don't necessarily know at the start every instance where emphasis is going to be called in or tagged within that data. If it switches to an italic and a bold, you want to be sure that you've chosen a family that has italics and bolds that are clear and are not going to throw off the reading experience when they come into play. What's great about the ability to work with real fonts and embedded fonts now is that you're not just stuck with the sort of the very blunt choices of a regular to a bold in default system fonts, but you can actually work with the subtlety that's available to you with families that have a greater range of weights. So you can control hierarchy, you can control weight as scale changes, so that, again, you can create a richer, a more subtle experience with more carefully controlled information design within the text. And now that there's a little bit more clarity about how you can specify these specific fonts within a family within the spec, this is a real credible option to work with. In a way, taking what was pretty straightforward in print production into the electronic book production once and for all. Open type features are a really, really great way of adding personality and function to text. Things like ligatures are not just visual frills, but they do smooth out the experience as the eye moves across a line of text. Different number styles help numbers either stand out or blend into the text as needed. Swashes and contextual alternates do the same thing. Sometimes they're more for personality, sometimes they really are for legibility, as are real small caps versus the artificially generated ones. You do have to look very carefully at what typeface offers when you're specifying these. Not all fonts have the same features defined, but of course when you go to a vendor's website, they usually have some indication about what is available. There'll be glyph maps or there'll be breakdowns of what features are supported. And of course, ask the vendor if you're not sure. We want to help you make good stuff, so if you can make our fonts look good, we'll help you make your books look good. Using type once you've chosen the fonts is another issue that it's worth taking some care with. This effect of the way that font sizes appear to change based on the design can very easily be smoothed over if you begin specifying line heights in fixed units versus proportional units, so that even if you have to bump up the size of a particular style, a particular typeface style, you won't have to necessarily throw off the line height because you've specified in a percentage of the size or in M units. If you specify exactly how many pixels you want, you know that it can absorb the switch from one design to another if you're mixing. And I say as a general rule of thumb, since we know that the effect of rasterizing type on screen tends to roughen up the shapes of the letters, a little bit more air whenever possible helps keep the letters easy to distinguish and easy to read. But there's a sweet spot. You don't want to go too far. You don't want to spread it across too much. But considering that the reader has the ability to adapt size on a screen device is good, but you also want to make the first impression right out the bat. So I would recommend favoring a little bit more space between the lines because number of pages isn't an issue in this case. So you can be generous, you can expand and move forward. Color is as big effect on screen as it is in prints. There's a little bit more of an issue with screen devices because the less contrast you have between text and background, the harder it is to create this illusion of smooth type because you can't make as many steps from one color pixel to another. What we are doing at Monotype and some other foundries are beginning to do is actually adjusting typeface designs and create versions much better suited to use on screen. So for instance, Bembo, which we know is an older style of typeface that has a smaller X height and a tighter fit, we've created new versions shown in red here, which have more open spaces, a little bit sturdier lines to it, and will just display more easily on screen. Here's an example. We've done the same with Helvetica. We've opened up those spaces between the letters so a little bit more air can get in, and so that letters are a little bit less likely to collide at small sizes. And we're paying a lot of attention to newer designs that come out to making sure that right off the bat they have crisp, regular features that we know will show up on screen. So we're taking into account the effect of pixels right away. Malabar is a particular example of this. It has a nice crisp design. There's detail when you look at it big, but it's crisp enough to hold its shape and its legibility small. Here's an example of it. This is one of the default fonts on the Nook, and you can see just a shot of how it looks on screen. Nice and crisp and clear and easy to read. And we're going to keep going forward with this. But of course, we need feedback from everyone who's working with these products to let us know if we are providing you with the experience that you need and to let us know what's not working so we can see what we can adapt. Because like I said, if you make great stuff, it makes our products look good as too, and then everyone's happy, which is the ultimate goal of all of this. So thanks very much.